what is favorable and less favorable rebirth?
We have a favourable rebirth because we're humans.
So then how does karma function there?
For them, it doesn't require a deity to sort of pull you out or to give you grace or to absolve anything.
Let's say if my karmic balance is anyways inherently negative before I take the human form, and if I lead a normal life, it will still be in the negative. That will result in a more suffering oriented life. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Thakkar show. Today we again have our OG guest, Dr. Gary Donnelly. And today we're going to talk about karma, which is sort of an underlying thread in all major schools of Indian philosophy.
Yes, I would say so.
So, when we say Indian philosophy, there are sort of two major things that we see which is very common or sort of fundamentally accepted among all different schools, that is rebirth and karma.
Yeah.
So, what pattern do we find across all Indian schools?
Good question. So, karma, rebirth, common to basically all of the classical Indian schools of philosophy, with the exception of the Charvakas and the Ajivakas. Everybody else accepts it in some form. The basic pattern. So, causal effect. Karma is generally thought of as a cosmic force that arbitrates causation in some way. And what is the causation that it arbitrates? The cycle of rebirths. They're linked fundamentally. And I guess the pattern that you see across all of the systems which accept karma and rebirth view karma as the mechanism by which rebirth operates. So without karma, it'd be very difficult to account for any notion of rebirth, especially if we're talking about favourable and less favourable rebirths.
What is favorable and less favorable rebirth?
Well, we have a favourable rebirth because we're humans, and that gives us the chance to sort of focus our mind in the right way, that we might reach a point where we are no longer reborn in a way that it would be really difficult for like one of my dogs or one of my parrots to do. So being reborn as a human is in many ways a gift, and because it gives you the opportunity to focus on the religious path of your choice, whichever one it is that you buy into, to eventually reach liberation in a way that sort of a less favourable rebirth as some sort of animal or worse doesn't afford you. So we have a good one. The only one above us are the gods, I think.
But then, what is it? Is it a kind of bias, or is there any argument given on why being born as humans is more favorable? Because we also see that suffering is again an underlying idea across all philosophies, and it is also sort of majorly accepted that the life is suffering, or the normal life is suffering.
The normal life, yeah. And this is, I guess, the other underpinning point. When we talk about karma, it's almost always linked to some sort of soteriology or release. And the various schools account for it in different ways, but I suppose the way that I would put it is, even though humans are born, we live these lives. Some of us have a much more blessed life than other people. It would be stupid to claim that every human has a fantastic life without suffering. It's just not true. The point that a lot of these schools want to drive at is, even with that suffering, you have the chance to make a change. So yes, you might be born into suffering and you might have a horrendous life, but that does not necessarily stop you from reaching a point whereby you can cut off your karmic bonds and reach liberation. And actually, some people might say that suffering through austerities might be a better way to reach that point.
Interesting. So, you said that it is more causal, the understanding of karma. What sort of basic underlying principle that goes on to it? It sort of is it only governed by causality? Because if we see in a few schools that some rituals and some traditions sort of help you cut the karma which sort of is already there.
Yeah.
So how is it purely causal, or what? How do we understand?
That's a good question, a very good question. So the way I usually explain it to students when we're talking about the sort of orthodox schools of Hinduism is that it's less the case that karma is governed by causation, and more that it is an integral part of the causal makeup of the cosmos. And even with the ritualists like the Purvamamamsa, it doesn't get any. It's very, very basic. It's the basic force. The Buddhists change the picture slightly because it becomes one of many causal factors. But I think it's fair to say that for a lot of the classical Hindu schools, what we now call Hindu schools, the karmic sort of system is the causal process at play in the universe to a large extent. So, yes, you can do things that can cut off karma or diminish karma, gain more merit, and things like this. The precise mechanism of which differs by tradition. But what you are really doing there is refusing to take part in the causal process and finding ways in which you can do that. And the idea that persists in various ways, and it's sort of put across differently, again, depends on each tradition, is that you reach a point where either you've burnt up all of your pre-existing karma and you are not making any more karma, and this is a point where a lot of the traditions will say that we can start to think about release and what release might look like, what liberation might look like. So it's always there on some level, but you can do things to sort of cut off how tied to it that you are. The only exception to that, or one of the big exceptions to that, is Advaita, for whom karma is real only conventionally, and from an ultimate perspective, it has no operation because there is no differentiation or rebirth or anything like that from the ultimate perspective.
Interesting. So when we talk about these traditions like Advaita, then there are also traditions like Samkhya and Yoga. It sort of believes that we do not need a direct intervention of God
Yeah.
in causal processes.
Yeah.
So then how does sort of karma function there? Because when we specifically, let's say, talk about the 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 intervenience, or let's say the shortcut or cutting out of the causal processes through rituals and traditions, when we do not have, let's say, a supreme authority to sort of intervene or um, accept our choice of not going through the general causal process. How does then karma function in those traditions?
So this is a really cool thing with things like Samkhya in particular. For them, karma is entirely a material process. So I'm not saying it's physical, but it's a material process, and it's caused, they would say, by movements of the gunas. It doesn't require a deity to sort of pull you out or to give you grace or to absolve anything. What they really want to see in these traditions is you cutting off, making more ties, yeah. And this doesn't need to be spooky or sort of metaphysical. It's done in a very normal way through, especially because you talk about through rituals and stuff. The Mamamsa were the same, no need for a god. And the Mamamsa view on it is something like the ideal person will perform only mandatory rituals, and that is enough to push the action, because karma does mean action. But yeah, for Samkhya, I guess the big one for the deity is Nyaya, right? And things that stem from the Nyaya tradition. Samkhya Mimamsa don't really have much to say about the deity. We can call them atheistic. And karma as a material process, how does it work? Well, basically when you do an action, there's a movement, and karmic grains, if you want to call them that, attached to the body or the intellect as little seeds. And what that does later down the line is, when the conditions are right, sprouts into the fruit of that karma, or the phala. Does it need a god? No. It's a natural law, and we have that in Christian sort of context too, where there's a way that the universe ticks over, and we don't need to appeal to the intervention of a god. So what is the way for liberation in such a framework? A clear, distinctive mind, which is free from, I guess, the karmic grains. The Buddhists would call it a defilement or something like that. But the system doesn't necessarily need a god, because it's a material process, and it's built into the workings of the universe. That's just how it is. So to cut it off is a matter of purifying the mind. And it's not even inherently moral. The moral aspect is incidental to that. So it just so happens that acting in a certain way gives you a clear mind, which stops you from generating these sorts of karmic seeds, which stops them from sticking to you, which stops them from fruiting, and from developing. And then they want to talk about liberation in that sort of sense. It's freedom from the fruits of karma.
Right. Do you also think that karma, because like as you said, it is actions and fruits of actions. Like obviously it is linked to the certain acts of morality, but how much do you think moral causation also affects karma? Because when Samkhya says that it is purely materialistic,
Yeah.
then morality, how does it sort of function around karma when we usually see it as more actionable and more materialistic?
I think ultimately it boils down to the conception of release from the karmic cycle, from the cycle of rebirth, and what that involves. And I mean, it's easy to say it's not necessarily moral, but it is a feature, we could say, of basically every tradition that talks about karma, that there is a moral aspect. And I've heard it said before, and I've probably taught before at undergraduate level, that one helpful sort of heuristic way to think of karma for a student who's only just getting to grips with it is as a moral cause and effect, which doesn't need a sort of, karmic banker giving and taking tokens and giving and taking rewards. But that can happen, but doesn't need it, because it so happens to be the way that the world is set up. And I think actually, for a tradition like Samkhya, I think that would be the position that they have to arrive at. They would just say, well, even if it's coincidental that morality allows us to see through the stuff that, or to act in ways that cuts through all the chuff and chaff and stops the karmic grains from sticking to us. Even if that's a moral thing, it's kind of like, it's incidental. It's not, the primary point isn't necessarily morality. The primary point is liberation. Mm-hmm. And so the two marry up in a kind of uneasy way, I guess.
Could they also say that the way morality manifests, it always manifests through material actions, and because of that, because
I see.
for example, let's say if I think bad for someone, it is not a karma unless I speak bad or I do bad for the person.
Yeah.
So if my my morality of thinking good or bad manifests itself through actions of speech or function or any material cause, does that argument sort of fit in with this?
I guess it does. But I think, well, we've got to see what's going on when that happens. So for basically all of the Hindu schools, I think intention doesn't really matter. Like, say, thinking it alone isn't enough. Doing it or saying it and causing something to come out into the world is what brings about some sort of karmic fruit, be that neutral, positive or negative. But the question then is, well, how does that karmic fruit operate? And it operates on you as the person making sense of these things and doing or not doing these actions, yeah. And in this sense, again, I still think it's kind of, I mean, I could be wrong and people might disagree. I still think it's kind of incidental whether it's moral or not, because the fact is, when you do these things, you are clouding your own mindset. So the fact that the behaviours that are better or worse suited to orientating yourself towards release, the behaviours that do better orientate you towards release, I guess we would say, are, you know, better behaviours, more wholesome behaviours, things that allow you to see clearly, things that allow you to see without bias, to see things, you know, to use the old phrase, as they really are. You know, some sort of liberating insight, maybe. Is that because the thing is necessarily moral, or is it just because the system is how it is, and behaving in nice ways clouds our judgment less? Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're behaving in negative ways, or you're acting negatively towards someone, then of course you impact them. But the main impact for these theories is to you. And these grains are sticking in your body, in your intellect. And this is continuing the karmic sort of process along and along and along. Negative ones are going to obviously provide you with a negative experience at some point. Positive ones with a positive experience at some point. But the main driver then seems to be neutral and disinterested action, which you'll see referred to, I guess, a lot in like the Bhagavad Gita and, you know, things like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, doing your duty, doing your dharma without too much care about anything else is really the key point here. So morality, yes, when we look at it as a whole system, we can say, and we do say, acting in this way is more moral than acting in that way. But I think actually what these thinkers would say in response to that is, well, yes, but also getting caught up in morality rather than just doing your duty is to prolong your karmic existence. And they all agree, every tradition agrees that even positive karma is still taking part in the process. The difference comes in what we conceive of as liberation, which, as I say, in Samkhya is materialist, and is atheist. Someone like the Nyaya going to say, well, yeah, this negative stuff is going to set you further back, but that is because it takes you further away from God, and not just because it gives you a cloudier mind or gives you more biases. So I think it's a wishy-washy answer. It's not always immediately clear to me where morality neatly fits in the Samkhya system, especially. It's there, but are we imposing it onto the system because we see that some behaviours are better if we're aiming towards release, or is it the case that it is inherently moral? And I think that's, for me, that's not really a settled question. So I'm aware that's not really an answer.
No, it's interesting because when we say that intentions doesn't matter, and then we also talk about detachment, it sort of gets a bit vague on what exactly does it mean.
Yeah, because the intention, it seems to conflict with being detached, right? If intention doesn't matter, why be detached?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the way that I think of this is that the detachment is kind of I suppose you might want to compare it to someone like Kant, where you do your duty for the sake of the duty, and it doesn't matter what the impact of it is, and it doesn't matter what you think of that. You just do it because that's your duty. Whereas I think for these traditions, everything has its own swadharma, its own cause for being, its own duty, the religious law, that we're bound to follow. I think being disinterested or just doing the dharma as prescribed isn't so much about, should we say, intention as maybe it is about identification. So this is to do with how we think about souls or Atman and Jivas. which is traditionally where we think that the karmic effects are exercised. Yeah. For the later traditions, things like the Brahman don't act. They're ultimately, blissful, non-acting, non-dual, non-different. So it doesn't make sense to say that from a liberated point of view, there's something engaging with the world in a way that can bring about karma. So we say, okay, on a conventional level, the jiva is the one doing the engagement. And then we've got to pull it back to, I think, when we're talking about intention and when we're talking about carrying out dharma without sort of thinking about it too much and doing it because that's just what you do. There is a murky difference. There is. And it's not the same as deontology because you do the dharma. You're just bound to do the dharma, and you do the dharma because it's the religious law and because it's prescribed to you by the Vedas. Yeah. Whereas someone like Kant wouldn't say you do it because it's prescribed. You do it because it's a moral law that you can replicate in every instance for every thinking human being. So there's a difference. But there's a similarity in the approach, is what I'm getting at. Where it doesn't matter what you think about it. If it's prescribed by the Vedas, then you do it. You just do it. And intention there certainly doesn't matter. Because what you're doing is that the Vedas are authoritative. And in virtue of that, if it tells you to do something in one of the Vedas, you just do it. And the take on that changes only ever so slightly in the later traditions, but the Vedas always remain authoritative. It's just that how do we interpret the laws? And the later we get, especially with things like Advaita and things like Vishishtadvaita, we can see that these ultimate laws maybe aren't so ultimate. And they work on a conventional level rather than an ultimate level. But yeah, another wishy-washy answer, I think. But yeah, for me, I think we would say that the intention doesn't matter because the Vedas just tell you to do it, so you should just do it. Later on, we talk about disinterested action, and we would say, because you don't want to get anything out of it, or, especially with Advaita, disinterest, so you don't generate any more karma one way or the other. But it's a mixed bag, and this is where it's hard to pin down karma to one thing because while all these traditions agree that it exists and that the process exists and that it's fundamental to the process of rebirth and that it's fundamental in the process of soteriology or salvation or release, exactly how it operates, I think every single one of them has a different take on. It's like speaking of it in broad terms about intentions, things like this, it really depends who you ask.
Because last time when I talked to Professor Lipner, he described Hinduism as something which is very different from what a lot of Westerners describe it. It is the West mostly describes it as independent rivers independent subsidiaries branching out from the river of Vedas.
Yeah.
But what Professor Lipner described it as a banyan tree. I don't know what's the English name of it, but it is. I'll just search. What is the English name? It is Ficus bengalensis or Ficus indica. Yeah. So it is almost like it starts as a normal tree with one stem, broad roots.
Right.
And when it grows on, the branches drops their own stem. The stem goes into ground and it functions as an independent tree.
Even though it's still connected.
Even though it is connected. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really nice analogy, actually. That's true. I mean, obviously that is true because Julius Lipner is the man for Hinduism. He literally wrote the book, But I think that's a really helpful way to look at it, and that's part of the problem especially for like academic philosophy and academic religious studies and things like this, because we like to put things in neat little boxes, and actually a lot of the time that's just not right. And I think my all over the place answers to those questions probably demonstrate that there's a shared heritage and there's shared principles. But yeah, what the Nyaya think over here is connected to what the Mimamsakas think over here. It's connected, but the
They're
binaries of it
distinctly
are
different.
different. Yeah, yeah, distinctly different is a good way to put it. It's not. Sometimes it's not even close. So they're talking about the same thing, kind of, but in radically different ways. And then by the time the sort of Jainas and the Buddhists come along and into the conversation, they again make it completely different. So I think that's a nice analogy, which we should expect from someone of Professor Lipner's standing, shouldn't we?
Yeah, I mean, you are in his lineage, though.
I'm via Chris. That's a nice thought. I don't know. Imagine. It's very cool that you got to speak to Julius Lipner. Very cool.
Yeah, it was indeed. But yeah, coming back, it's like, I mean, it is kind of interesting to think of how sort of you explained Kant's thought on karma as being more duty than sort of a moral action. But then I would also sort of think it in this way, that if if we are anyways moving towards detachment, where sort of the fundamental answer, or let's say the fundamental equation should be zero for me to liberate, why would I stick my duties to good or positive actions or karmas if I inherently want to be neutral?
That's a good point. Well, I'm not sure it's about if you want to be neutral. I think it's more of the case that you need to be neutral. So again, this your desire about it isn't really a major consideration. It just so happens that the way that this process operates, depending on the exact explanation of liberation that we're getting at, requires that you act in neutral ways. And again, a lot of this is just simply because the Vedas decree it. And because the Vedas decree it, then you do it. And that's because the universe ticks along in these ways. It's described in the Vedas, and then later texts like the Bhagavad Gita, especially telling you the real value of disinterested execution of your dharma. I guess it's the essential theme of that text, really. It's not so much about what you want; it's about how things are. What you think about that doesn't really matter, insofar as you can have your opinion on it, but it's not going to change anything. And then the other thing I want to pick up when you said, why would you stick your duties to positive things? I think if they aren't positive, then they aren't duties. Do you see what I mean? So the duties are described in the religious texts, and we might even want to say they're not inherently moral, one way or the other, but your choice to adhere to them is in some degree a moral choice, because depending on the tradition, it's been decreed, and this is the way that Ishvara wants it to be, or that it's been revealed to the rishis when the Vedas were originally heard. And so it would be a strange thing, I think, to try and think of a duty or a religious law or a religious principle that was negative, shall we say, in this way, because what we are saying is possible in these religious texts is a release from this thing we're bound up in, the samsaric cycle. So a religious text wouldn't give you a duty that was going to set you back on that journey. It would only give you things to do that will get you closer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So they're not trying to throw obstacles in your way. They're trying to give you the map.
But then, if I stick to the idea of it being the liberation being more neutral, it also comes with an inherent understanding that everything in the past has been in negative side. So you need to have a positive duty so that you can come to neutral. And this is also what makes me think that when they say normal human life is suffering as well. Because let's say if my karmic balance is anyways inherently negative before I take the human form,
Yeah,
and if I lead a normal life, it will still be in the negative. That will result in a more suffering oriented life, which sort of makes me more dutiful towards uh, doing or taking on more positive
I
karmas.
see what you're getting at. Yeah, so because you feel the weight of this karmic debt already, you want to do more to mitigate against it, to pay it off, as it were. Yeah, that is a nice point, and I'm not sure if there's a single consolidated position on this, but I do. Some of the traditions wouldn't agree that thinking about it in this way is helpful. Others would, and I know if we're talking about something like the Nyaya tradition, then talking about it in these ways is helpful, because release ultimately depends on you gaining God's grace, and to do that, you need to show devotion, and you need to work to get lots of positive merit rather than tons and tons of negative stuff. And the implication is always there that you couldn't go around accruing tons of negative karma, like by being a warlord who massacres innocents, and still expect to get God's grace. You've got to do good things to get God's grace, yeah. So on that sort of viewpoint, yeah, I agree. I just think on something like the Mimamsa view and the Samkhya view, I think it's just a little bit more, it pulls back from that type of discussion. And even talking about, I mean, obviously we do talk about neutral, positive and negative karma, but I think the significance of this stuff is different, and it doesn't quite have the same impetus as it does when you're talking about maybe the devotional takes on this stuff, where you're relying on something else other than sort of cutting the fetters to gain liberation, because you're relying on someone giving that to you. And that, in that case, you're absolutely right that you need to work hard to gain lots of positive and to gain the grace that you need to be plucked from samsara and placed into release.
And also because I grew up in a Hindu family, we were also told, and I'm not sure this thing is from any particular tradition or from any book which is interpreted in a different way in different
Yeah,
traditions. They say that human form may not be the first form we took, and there are a few different forms we took before to get to the human form, and
yeah,
then based on how we function in human form, we get our next form. Either we'll continue as a human form, and if it is too bad, we might take a lower form like animals or
yeah.
anything. So do you think if we consider this pretext of human form not being the first ever form we take, then because we took less favorable forms, it anyways sort of made us more karmically negative or karmically in debt to start human form with the pretext of suffering?
That's a really good point. I just wanted to add in there that it doesn't need to come from any of the big books, and this is the other thing about some of the Indian traditions, especially in what we call Hinduism, even out of the big schools. There's so much mixture with sort of local traditions and regional and indigenous different types of religiosity and different types of philosophies that, again, drawing these distinctions sometimes is hard. And so much gets mixed in that when you go and, it's all very well me sitting here and saying this is Advaita Vedanta or this is Nyaya, but when you go and speak to a Vaishnavite in India, his version of it's going to be different, because there's so many more influences. And I think this is always the case, I think, with religion. It's the same here with, like, I grew up as a Catholic in Catholic family, Catholic schools, but there's so many different influences on that, depending on even where your family's from. So, like, my family's Irish, and Irish Catholics look at things in a different way to sort of like English Catholics or Italian Catholics, French Catholics. The influences are different. So, yeah, I just wanted to get that out there straight away. But yeah, I think that's a really nice point, actually. And one thing that I remember when I was doing my undergrad with Chris, and one thing I said to him, one seminar well, what's the karma of my dog? And Chris was kind of like, well, animals still create or are, bound by karma. It's just not in the same way that we do, obviously. But I think, actually, I'm really interested. I don't think I can ever answer it because But how does a creature like that? Maybe it's just a case of because you burn through karma just by living. In that way, they're kind of like calories or something, I guess. Just by being there, you are paying or returning or getting rid of, working through. It's always around. So if we're thinking about favourable and less favourable rebirths, even being a lower form is working through some of the stuff that got you there. And I guess, I don't know, but can an animal generate negative karma? And so by the time they get to a human form, is that like the reward because they've...
Maybe I think independence is what sort of distincts the form and the favorability of form.
Yeah.
Because as an animal, I'm more indebted to my primal instinct, so
Of
I have
course.
less independence of making
And
decisions.
no higher cognitive capabilities that
Yeah.
we know of.
And being human gives an extremely high sense of
Yeah.
independence in comparison to animals, and that makes the changes in my karma more important based on my duties rather than following my primal instinct.
Right. Yeah, I think that's about right. And your choices are more impactful in the world. Not just to you, to other people, and wider society, and to the animals and other things over which we have some sort of dominion, rightly or wrongly. So I think something like that must be the case. And then by the time you get to a human birth, then really, this is often talked about, the human birth is a gift because you can make this change and you do have the opportunity to go and live in a certain way. You do have the opportunity to know what release is, even if it's only abstractly, because you need that abstract idea of it to pursue it. And then, once you get there, the various types of knowledge will show you what release is. But yeah, I think that must be, something like that must be at play, because I don't think we can make too much sense of favourable or unfavourable and better or worse rebirths without that, actually.
So, Gary, when we're talking about like karma, it is very, very vague from what we've discussed till now in terms of how exactly it is being interpreted. But the common line which we can see it is almost like there are bad karmas and good karmas, and then they have impact based on their categories. And that impact leads to the changes in your pathway to liberation in whichever specific pathway you sort of go or believe in. But I just want to understand if if I want to, let's say, start off with understanding Indian philosophy in general, then how do I understand causation? Is it only through karma, or karma could be the best way to define causation?
Good question. So for some of the traditions, karma would be a sort of morally infused cosmic cause and effect. For some of the other traditions, it's part of the picture, maybe even the big part of the picture. And then by the time the Buddhists come around, it's one part of the picture, and then not in the way that we think. So it's another one, whereas, yeah, there is fundamentally, it's playing a causal role somewhere. But the precise extent to which that causal role takes precedence, or, is more or less involved, again, depends on the school doing the interpreting. And I think the big pullback in terms of most minimal account of karmic condition is probably from the Buddhists, who make a number of innovations, the first of which is to do with intention. So for Buddhists, they flip it on its head a little bit, and they say that the category relevant for any sort of karmic impact whatsoever is intention. So what this would mean is that if you have a good intention and the action that you do brings about a horrific consequence, then the horrific consequence doesn't matter because the intention was good. And if you have a really bad intention but somehow accidentally bring around fantastic impact in the world, that fantastic impact doesn't really matter because your initial motivation was bad. And that was something that hadn't really been formulated before by any of the other mainstream traditions. And the Buddhists were the first ones to really do that. And there's plenty of places you can read about this where the Buddha says, intention, I tell you, is karma, and in the Pali Canon, in all of the canon. What they also do, the other big innovation, was they placed it as part of the process with praticya samutpada, or dependent origination, and it doesn't account for all of dependent origination, it only accounts for one part of it, one part of the 12 links. So in that sense, for the Buddhists, it's a very limited, it's significant insofar as there is rebirth, and there is karmic merit and demerit, but it's only one part of the causal story, and that was a real innovation, pushing back against basically every other, contemporaneous understanding of karma at the time of the Buddha. And that's I did have something else to say on that I forgot, but I think that's the biggest out of all of this classical era schools of Indian philosophy. The Buddhists probably pull the significance back the most, and they want to give much more agency to you than they do to the process that's doing the conditioning. This is the other thing I want to say. The other thing that the Buddhists are really, really keen on is that it's not inevitable that a karmic seed is going to be actualized. So it might be, it might not. The conditions have to be right, and that's another big innovation. For a karmic seed to sort of blossom, then all the other conditions to which it is subject in dependent origination and all that sort of stuff have to marry up. It has to be exactly right. If not, then that effect will not fruit or flower. And that's really, really significant for the Buddhist account of liberation too. So there's a lot going on with the Buddhists on karma. It's almost a top-down reimagining, where the action is less significant than the intention, and the possibility of you sort of not actualising a karmic payoff is very real. The conditions might not be right, in which case it may never come to fruition, or something might happen that cuts it off, in which you'd be liberated or whatever else. And it could just be the case that nothing comes round to it. You've got this karma somewhere off in the future, it just doesn't really happen. Everything else has to marry up. And that is radically different from the orthodox Vedic schools and the Vedanta schools. And we don't really see that coming up anywhere else before the Buddha, or before the earliest attestations of the Buddha.
Interesting. So if we, let's say, sort of summarize the understanding of karma, and through the way how Professor Lipner gave the idea of Hinduism, does Buddhism stand out as more of an independent tree, slightly connected to the original?
Maybe a bit further away, but still connected, but
mostly independent.
That's a really good question, actually. Now, there are plenty of Buddhists who would say yes, because I don't know, you may have noticed this, but especially with my engagements online, and especially with modernist Buddhists who appreciate and are drawn into the sort of 20th century movements, there's a strong sense of exceptionalism, where they want it to be radically different to the sort of Indo-Gangetic traditions from which it drew its inspiration, where it came. I think you can make that claim, but for me, I don't know. I think I would still want to say that I really like Julius Lipner's analogy. Then I think it still fits. I think they did reimagine it, but the function of it and the mechanics of it are still there. So there's still something conditioning, your moral behaviours, even if the focus has switched from the action itself to the intention behind the action, it's still doing similar work. It's still conditioning your life, or future lives, or future rebirths, so it's still doing that sort of thing. And it's still an obstacle to, liberation. So yeah, I would say I think it fits in with your analogy really well still, because the shared heritage is strong enough that even the flipping understanding doesn't make it something totally different. It's just it is a radical reinterpretation, but they could still talk about it to a Brahmin and then understand each other. It's not, they wouldn't be talking past each other, they wouldn't misunderstand. They disagree on the operation, but they'd know exactly what they were talking about. And I think that's the key thing to take. And I'm really big on this, and you've seen this with my online interactions as well. Religion, full stop, I think, is messy. And there's a lot of cross-pollination between traditions, wherever you situate them all over the world. And actually, we should embrace these shared backgrounds and these shared heritages. And if we are being honest and we are looking for the truth of what we can trace with the evidence, then it seems so clear to me that Buddhism is a product of the Indo-Gangetic, Greater Magadha, Shramana traditions for sure. But it's also true that, especially the later on we get, it's heavily, heavily, heavily influenced by Vedic Brahmanism. And we see this in tons of ways, not just the way they talk about karma, but the sort of pan-Indian focus on all this stuff: rebirth, liberation, karma, yes. It even focuses on, the types of meditation, what types of veneration and worship are appropriate or inappropriate, the conceptions of what the highest achieving person looks like even shares some similarities across traditions. So I think they are, in some ways, they are very far apart, but you can't deny that the roots are connected. Yeah, and I really dislike it when people try to say that that's not the case, because I think all the evidence that we have says that they absolutely are connected, even if it's not in the ways that we previously thought.
Interesting. So that's all the questions I had for you this time.
Cool.
Do you have anything else you want to say on this?
No, not really, I don't think. It's tested me, this one, because I feel like my familiarity with the karma doctrine hasn't really been touched since I wrote my PhD thesis. So some rambly answers maybe. I'm much more comfortable with this stuff in terms of the Nyaya, Vedanta and Buddhism than I am with the other orthodox Hindu skills, which probably comes across. But yeah, it's been good fun. And it's given me ideas for stuff I can do online as well. So thank you.
Thank you for giving your time.
Absolutely, always. It's a pleasure.